Hey everyone, I'm Katie from Addicted to DIY, and today I'm going to be showing you how to make footrests that go underneath your desk in two different ways. So I'm not the tallest person, and I've always wanted a way to be able to sit for long periods of time at my desk and be comfortable, and having my feet dangling just isn't working for me. Also, my kids are home learning virtually, and my youngest is also not very tall right now, and so I wanted to make a way for us to both be able to sit at the office and work comfortably, not have our feet dangling. I don't want him to have any strains or anything like that while he's working on school. So I built these two different footrests. One of them is very simple and one of them is a little more complicated just to make things fun. So follow along and I'll show you how I did all of it. I'll start with the simple design first. This footrest is literally as simple as cutting a board and attaching legs. I used a 1x10 scrap board that I had and cut it down to length, which is about 15 inches. Obviously, the dimensions of this are totally up to you. If you happen to have plywood rather than a board, use that. If you'd like to make it longer, go for it. I sanded the board down smooth on all sides and edges with 220 grit sandpaper, then marked out the locations of the holes on my hairpin legs. I did this prior to staining because it's just easier to see everything while the wood is still its natural color. I stained the board with special walnut stain, then attached the hairpin legs. These legs came with screws that were far too long for the 3/4 inch board, so I grabbed some 3/4 inch screws that I had on hand and used those. I pre-drilled the holes for the screws with a 1/16 inch drill bit, then attached the legs. Literally, this footrest took less than 15 minutes start to finish, and I could have totally stopped there, but that would have been way too easy. I decided to make a second one that was a little more complex, use up some more of the wood I had on hand, and try out a new to me technique that I've had on my list, patterned plywood. For the second footrest, I went over to a sheet of Baltic birch I've had for a while and cut it down to a smaller size with my adaptive cutting system. I set the fence on my table saw to 1 inch and started ripping the plywood down into 1-inch sticks. Once I was satisfied with the number of sticks I'd ripped down, I took them over to my workbench to glue them up. I set them up on my parallel clamps, offsetting them, as my next step would involve cutting them at a 45-degree angle. I flipped the sticks so that I could add glue to the veneer face using a glue roller. You can also use a small paint roller and tray to do this. I worked in small bits at a time so that the glue didn't dry out too fast before I could get all of the pieces together, then clamped everything tight. I grabbed a few other clamps to clamp the ends of the sticks together the best I could, so that way everything stuck together nice and evenly. I let it dry for a couple of hours, then unclamped it and sanded it down. It was taking a while with my orbital sander, so I ended up going over to my drum sander to speed up the process. With the panel sanded smooth, I used my track saw to cut a 45-degree angle on one end. I definitely should have offset the sticks more than I did, as I ended up cutting off a larger piece of waste than I had wanted. Back over at my table saw, I ripped the panel down once again into 1-inch strips. I used my gripper push block for this to keep the wood against the fence and my fingers free from the blade. As I ripped down the sticks, I made sure to keep everything in the same order, but flipping the strips so that the plies ran opposite of each other to create a chevron pattern. Back over at my workbench, I set up all of the strips in the chevron pattern, then flipped them over to add glue. I tightened them up in my parallel clamps and made adjustments as needed to make sure all of the plies lined up exactly. I added a clamp to the middle and let it sit for another couple of hours. With it being so hot here, the glue sets up pretty quickly. Once the glue cured, I took it back over to my table saw to cut the panel down again. This time, I wanted to play around with different design features. I set my fence to 2.5 inches and started cross-cutting the panel. Once I had enough pieces cut, I set the fence to 1 inch and cross-cut some more. Something as simple as changing the width of your cuts will completely change up the design of the plywood pattern. The plywood was ready for one final glue up, so I grabbed my glue roller and parallel clamps to glue it all together. It's important to pay attention during this step to make sure your points all line up. If some of the pieces come unglued, which can happen, just glue them back together as you're gluing up the strips. With both panels glued up, I clamped them and left them to dry overnight. The next day, I noticed that I had some separation in the joints of the larger panel, likely due to not using enough glue and also not clamping the ends of the panel together, only the sides. I decided to use some black CA glue and accelerator to patch up the gap in the wood. It definitely worked, but I really should have used clear CA glue for this. The plywood absorbed the black tinted glue and it definitely stood out. It's a lesson learned, and I'll work on not having any gaps next time. To sand the panels smooth, I once again took them over to my drum sander. Obviously, if you don't have a drum sander, you can use whatever sander you have on hand. Start with a coarse grit and work your way up. Once the panels were sanded smooth, I took them over to my table saw to make sure the edges were nice and smooth and squared up. I then sanded everything down with 220 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander, just slightly smoothing out the corners and edges of the panel as I went. It was a tough decision, and I polled my social media audiences for help, but ultimately I chose the elongated pattern for the footstool. I attached the hairpin legs to the bottom, then applied 3 coats of wipe-on polyurethane. I used 6-inch hairpin legs for this footstool and ended up switching the 8-inch hairpin legs for my son's footstool with the board. After trying out the 4-inch legs, he liked the height of the 8-inch legs the best. I'll link to both of those legs in the description below, along with the full tutorial on my website. Now my son and I are both able to sit comfortably at the desk and have a place for our feet while we work. The only downside is that he prefers to work alone and doesn't want me in the office while he's doing schoolwork. I guess he doesn't want mom photobombing his classroom video calls. I hope you enjoyed watching this video today and learning the new techniques that I've shared. For more video tutorials just like this one, make sure that you subscribe to my YouTube channel and also hit the bell icon so that you'll be alerted every time I publish a new video. I've also queued up a few others that I think you might enjoy. Thanks so much for watching.